everyone, so today we're going to go over numbers in Python and the different types of numbers, which are integers, floats, and complex numbers. We're also going to learn about how to convert these types into other types of numbers. So for example, converting an integer to a float or a float to an integer. Let's get started by opening our Python console by typing Python 3 in our terminal. So first we're going to go over integers. An int, or an integer, is a positive or negative whole number without decimals of an unlimited length. So it can be as simple as x equals 1. We can check the type of that. It will return that it is an integer. It can also be a very long number like this. Check the type of that. It's going to tell us it's an integer. And integers can also be negative. Next, we're going to look at floats. A float, or a floating point number, is a positive or negative number that contains decimals. So a float can be x equals 1.23. We can check the type of that variable. It'll tell us it's a float. A float can also be something as simple as y equals 1.0. Check the type of that. It's going to be a float. And it can also be negative, so let's try z equals 1.0, check the type, and it'll be a float. These numbers can also be written in scientific notation using an e to indicate the power of 10. So, for example, we can write x equals 35e3 and check the type of that, and it'll be a float. We're not going to get into the mathematics of the scientific notation, but if you want me to make a future video on that, I do have some knowledge on that, so just let me know. A float can also be written as a negative number. Check the type of that. It'll be a float. And a float can also have decimals, as you saw here. Next, we're going to go over complex numbers. Complex numbers are numbers that contain a real and an imaginary part. We will not get into the math of this, just like the scientific notation, but we'll just learn how to write complex numbers in Python. So a complex number can be something like this, where this part, the 9j, represents the imaginary part, and the 6 represents the real part. We can check the type of this, and it will tell us it's complex. These imaginary numbers can also be negative, so y equals negative 9j. We can check the type of this, and it will be complex. These can also just be comprised of the imaginary parts of the number, so z equals 4j. We can check the type of that, and it'll be complex. Now we'll look at converting to another number type from one certain number type. So for example, converting from an integer to a float. So let's instantiate our variables first. So we'll have x equals 3 and y equals 6.9. So first we will convert the number stored in the x variable to a float by doing a equals float of x. Now we can print the type of a, and that'll magically be a float because we've converted it. So let's print a, and it'll be 3.0. And we can also convert a float, which is in our y variable, to an integer by doing b equals int of y, and we'll print b, and that'll just be 6. So please note that it doesn't round up or down when you're converting from an integer, from a float to an integer. It'll just take this first chunk of the number, and that's what you're asking for when you do int of a float. We can also convert an integer or a float to a complex number, so let's see that here. So we have 6.9 plus 0j because we had no imaginary part. We can check that that is a complex number and, we can check that that is a complex number, and indeed it is. Thank you all so much for watching this video over on Kenzie's Code Corner. Please consider liking the video and subscribing if you learned something, and let me know what you'd like to learn down below in the comments. See you in the next one!